Hey guys, it's ayebeepee and welcome back to my channel. I have my bachelor's degree in criminal justice and a minor in psychology, and I'm going to say that for the next 41 videos because I'm just so proud of myself. On top of that, I am a board member of a nonprofit, and we help missing people, especially around the West Virginia area, and their family and loved ones to help them get resources they need in their search. And if you have anybody in your family or a loved one that is missing, please get a hold of us and we'll do what we can. And we are here with another one in the Unsolved in West Virginia series. And we are here to talk about the Matewan Massacre. So let's just get right in. Now let's start by talking a little bit about Matewan. It was founded in 1895, and this was a small town that a coal company controlled more or less, but it was not a typical coal camp. It was still a pretty independent town. And two major people in society of Matewan that we are going to be talking about is the mayor of Matewan, Cabell Testerman, and the chief of police, Sid Hatfield. So when the UMWA had hired John L. Lewis to be the president, miners ended up working longer hours and worked in unsafe and unethical work conditions. The company houses themselves were in really poor condition. They were getting paid really low wages, and politicians just seemed to be supporting these big coal companies instead of the miners themselves. Now, the Stone Mountain Coal Company had started using currency called scrips, and this was used for the goods at the stores and things that you would need within life, but this currency was strictly only used pretty much in coal camps. So the coal companies were giving you this scrip and you were just giving it right back to them and their businesses that they owned around town. And just a few months before the Matewan Massacre, there were places around America where coal miners were starting to strike. And when they did this, they received a full 27% pay increase. So when Lewis was starting to notice that people were wanting change, he started to plan to organize the coal fields in the southern Appalachia. So let's talk about Sid Hatfield for a minute. He was either born in 1891 or 1893 in Blackberry, Kentucky. And because of the gold caps on his teeth, he was known as Smiling Sid. Now in his teens, he was a coal miner, so this did make him support of the unionizing coal miners. And after that, he worked as a blacksmith for several years. But he ultimately, as we know, fought to be the chief of police. And something that everyone knew about Sid was that he was not afraid of a fight, especially if he really believed he was doing the right thing. Now let's talk about the spring of 1920 strike. Now this strike was because the operators of these coal companies had been trying to suppress the miners trying to unionize by hiring these private guards to pretty much just watch over them all the time. And this clearly caused tension to be at an all-time high because they just didn't feel like there was any trust there. And this caused around 3,000 men to sign the union roster. And they got their union cards at a community church. And they did know this meant they were risking pretty much everything that the Smith Mountain Coal Company provided them. Their money, their own currency that they use in that town, their homes, all of this. And the Stone Mountain Coal Company fought back with harassment, evictions, and mass firings. And this is about when the miners of Mingo County decided to strike. And they had the support of the UMWA. Now once the strike started, the company decided to start evicting pretty much immediately. They hired the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency to carry out these evictions. Most people called them the Baldwin Thugs at this time. And when this Baldwin Felts Detective Agency came to town, for some reason, local law enforcement kind of just stepped aside and let them do whatever they needed to do with no questions asked. And this even included murdering and beating people. They just let them do it. And they clearly were filled with hatred towards this Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, but honestly, they were also terrified. And because of the mass firings and evictions, this caused a massive amount of people in this community to have to live in tents, which it ended up getting the name of the Smith Mountain Coal Company Tent Colony. Now let's talk about the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency for a second. William Baldwin of Roanoke founded the Baldwin Felts Agency in the early 1890s. Now their main focus was to get people to not unionize with the UMWA, and also, like we've been talking about, help out the companies that need evictions done in the coal camps. In 1900, Thomas Felts joined the detective agency as an owner, and he helped with the legal advice of the firm. And William Baldwin and Thomas Felts had the reputation of scaring anyone in the mountains. And all of this will bring us to May 19th, 1920. 9 Baldwin and Felts detectives show up in Matewan on the number 29 train at around 11 a.m. The people on this train were John McDowell, Charles Cunningham, C.T. Higgins, Oscar Bennett, and also a few others. And they were seen with submachine guns in their suitcases. They met Albert Felts at the Matewan Depot, who we can assume was related to Thomas Felts, right? And then they went to where Stone Mountain Coal Corporation owned their property on Mate Creek. And at some point, their bookkeeper, Price, met them up there. Now, there were 4 agents that were carrying at this time. That was Albert Felts and Lee Felts, Charles Cunningham, and John McDowell. So then around noon this day, more detectives show up on the number 15 train. The people that showed up on this train were Lee Felts, G.W. Anderson, J.R. Anderson, and a few others. They went up and joined Albert Felts' group in Mate Creek. And about this time is when they started to evict families. The word spread pretty fast that these agents are finally here, and Mayor Testerman got in his car and sped off. He was also heard saying, "The detectives up there are putting some people out of their houses." A little while later, Sid Hatfield started calling Williamson, West Virginia, and he was trying to figure out if this process that the Baldwin Felts detectives go through is even legal to do. And this is when Testerman found a technicality. The technicality was you had to give 48 hours after you give them written eviction notice. So Sid and Mayor Testerman showed up to this tent colony and asked if they had written eviction notices. And this is when the Baldwin Felts detectives couldn't give them anything. They even tried to say this was just sanctioned by the court. Testerman then sent a letter to the sheriff in Williamson, and he was trying to get an arrest warrant on these Baldwin Felts detectives. And the warrant for Albert Felts and a few other detectives was starting its way back to Matewan. But we gotta remember, this is 1920. So you couldn't just like email or fax it. This had to be delivered on a train. And they said these warrants were sent on the number 16 train that would show up at 5 o'clock in Matewan. And ironically enough, this is the same train that the detectives was going to be taking back to Bluefield. Now, around 3:30 that day, the detectives in 2 separate cars were driven back to Matewan. They were brought to the Urias Hotel to eat dinner, and once they were done, they started walking to the train depot. Most were carrying suitcases, raincoats, and like rolled up parcels. And while the detectives were walking past the Testerman jewelry store, Sid left out the back of the jewelry store and was able to meet up with Albert Felts and the other detectives pretty easily. They ended up stopping about Chambers' furniture and hardware store, but something that I don't think a lot of people realized was there was a lot of minors hidden all over the place just watching what had happened because they were very unhappy with their circumstances, right? And these minors hiding around Mate Street were armed. Sid said he had an arrest warrant for the Baldwin Felts detectives. And Albert and Lee Felts said they had an arrest warrant for Sid Hatfield. And this arrest warrant was from the Justice for the Peace of Magnolia District of Mingo County, Squire R.M. Stafford. And Testerman just looked at this and said this was completely bogus. Sid and Albert walked away from the group a little bit, and it looked like they were trying to make light of the situation. Now, Albert had signaled for his men to follow him, and they kind of went all around the hardware store. But Oscar Bennett didn't follow. He ended up leaving the group for a second to go and find some cigarettes. Now, Sid went into the hardware store where Albert stood at the doorway, and Cunningham stayed with Albert. And the other men were just kind of hanging out around the front of the store in the street area. Sid spoke to Isaac Brewer at the store, and he was telling Brewer that these people were trying to arrest him with a bogus warrant. And he kind of just told Isaac, hey, go along with it. And Isaac initially agreed. Albert then leaned into the door and asked Sid if they wanted to talk about this and have a conversation. And Sid just said, no, I'm talking to Isaac about it. Petty. And around this time is when the shots started firing. Now, we have no idea who shot first or even the order of the bullets. It happened so fast. But Isaac Brewer, Dan Chambers, and Jeff Stafford said that Sid shot first. But Jim Webb, K.L. Mounts, and Garfield Young said Albert fired first. We know that Albert Felts shot from his coat pocket, and this hit Mayor Testerman in the stomach. And when this bullet hit, you could hear Testerman saying, Lord have mercy, I'm shot. He was helped on the 16 train when it got there, and they were trying as hard as they could to get him to a hospital in Welch, but ultimately he died en route. Now, it is thought that Albert shot over his shoulder to try to hit Sid Hatfield, but he ended up killing a guy named Tot Tinsley instead. Now, we do think that Sid Hatfield is who shot and killed Albert Felts. Lee Felts was shooting towards the hardware store, and it's thought that he was trying to shoot the hardware store owner Reese Chambers, which Reese was shooting back at Lee. Now, somehow though, Reese was never injured. Now, Detective A.J. Bauer had pretty much darted past the post office and bank as far as Mate Street, but he was shot to death. The Anderson brothers and Detective Higgins were running towards the clubhouse, but Detective Higgins was found shot and killed near the fence of this place. But it's thought that the Anderson brothers somehow was able to sneak on and board the 16 train to get out of there. Now, when Detective Oscar Bennett, that went for cigarettes, heard the gunshots, he did come over and kind of try to see what was happening, but he quickly just went to the train depot and ripped up any type of identification papers he had for himself and left. Now, these really unhappy miners that was just kind of scattered all over the place, it was brutal. They were shooting those detectives multiple times. There was just so much aggression towards them. Now, let's get into the deaths. Mayor Testerman obviously had died. I had said that earlier. And honestly, he's the only one in all of this that was issued a death certificate. Charles Cunningham was also a death. There were 2 bullet wounds that went through the top of his head. There was a bullet wound through his left shoulder, a bullet wound in his hip with no exit, and there was also an injury to his right thigh. Now, there were 7 detectives that ended up passing. Albert Feltz was one of them. He had a bullet wound that entered at his right ear and exited near his left ear. He had powder burns near his right ear, showing they were very close when he got shot. He had a bullet wound on his left cheek with no exit wound. There was also a powder burn on his cheek. There was a bullet wound near his right shoulder and spine with no exit wound. He had a bullet wound on his left arm near his elbow joint with no exit wound. And powder burns just covered his whole body. And all shots were thought to be from a handgun or a rifle. Lee Feltz did end up dying also. He only had 1 shot on his left side, and it was near his spine and shoulder blade. C.T. Higgins was another death. He had bruises on his face and a broken nose. He had a bullet wound that came from his right shoulder blade, I think, and exited near his groin. And he had a bullet wound that went from his left hip to like that same kind of frontal area. J.W. Ferguson was also a detective that ended up passing in this. He had a bullet wound near his left shoulder blade that did not have an exit. He had a bullet wound on his left upper arm. He had a bullet wound that went through his left hip to his penis and scrotum. And then he had a downward angle shot to his left thigh. Now, Detective A.J. Bauer was also one that passed. He had a bullet wound on his right scalp, but that did not penetrate his skull. He had a bullet wound to the right side of his body with no exit. He had a bullet wound to his hip that exited in the front of his thigh. And the last detective I want to talk about that passed was O.E. Powell. And he had a bullet wound to his torso that exited around his left kidney area. And there was 2 citizens that ended up passing just from being bystanders. And one was Bob Mullins. He was one that had just been fired for signing up with the union, and he had been shot and killed near the Matewan National Bank. And then Todd Tinsley, who you heard me mention earlier. And what's sad about him was he was actually completely unarmed, and he was just found laying near the Chambers Hardware and Post Office. And Isaac Brewer had also been shot in his shoulder, and his gun had been taken. There was at least 10 bullet holes all through the front of the Chambers Hardware store, and the door had bullet damage to the screen and the wooden frame. There has only been 3 confirmed photos of the crime scene of this horrible event. 2 pictures are of the back of the Chambers Hardware store, and then there's a picture of a 1 single bullet hole in the bank's window. And the Chambers Hardware building was torn down within 8 years of this happening, and there was absolutely no pictures of the interior of this store. Now we're going to fast forward to July 1920. The miners' union went on strike once again, and there was massive violence this time. They had blown railroad cars up. Strikers were beaten and left for dead just on the side of the road. Over 90% of miners in Mingo County had pledged to the union by this point. And they really used this opportunity to have completely, at this point, outnumbered the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. It used this by bullying them to stay out of that area. There was way too many of them now. But because of this, there was rumors that martial law was established, and they ended up using federal troops for a while to stop this striking, stop this violence. Now, there was a trial for the deaths of the 7 Baldwin Felts detectives. There were charges brought on Sid Hatfield and 22 others for the death of Albert Felts. The trial started on January 26, 1921, and it ended March 19th. And it ended with all of these people completely acquitted of this murder. Tom Phelps then brought a conspiracy charge against him, and this caused Sid to have to come back to court. Sid, his wife, Ed Chambers, and Ed's wife all came back to the courthouse. And while walking up the steps, Sid Hatfield and Ed Chambers was assassinated right there on the steps. And somehow, both of their wives survived. These people that were hired to do this then shot at the wall and kind of laid the guns around them to make it look like it was self-defense. And Sid was thought to be one of the first people to have ever stood up against the Baldwin Phelps detectives, which is why he fought against them until his very end. The Matewan Massacre is the reason that people know Mingo County as Bloody Mingo. And on April 27th, 1993, the Matewan Historical District was put on the register of the National Register of Historic Places. And on February 18th, 2015, the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum was opened in Matewan. The massacre was thought to be a major catalyst in these mine wars, specifically a catalyst for the March of Logan County and the Battle of Blair Mountain. William Baldwin did die in 1936, and Thomas Phelps died in 1937. And then that's when the detective agency pretty much dissolved in the next year. Now, most of the documents we have that talk about the Matewan Massacre was destroyed in a flood in that area. Now, closer to the 2000s, we did have pretty much a miracle happen. And in California, there was family members of someone named James Markham. And these family members got a hold of the West Virginia archives in Charleston. They explained that they were going through this man's files and everything, and they had found all these court documents that pertained to the Sid Hatfield trial. And they asked if they wanted them and sent them to the West Virginia archives, which is what a lot of the information I talked about with you came from. Now, what are your thoughts on this? Who do you think shot first? And which side do you agree with? But thank you guys so much for watching. This one was crazy. We finally got to dive into a Hatfield on this channel. But again, thank you guys so much for watching. Like and subscribe for me, and hit that notification button. That way you're notified the next time I upload. On top of that, I still have a GoFundMe going for Crystal Young. If you haven't already, you need to watch that video so you know why her mom needs that PI so bad. On top of that, I have stickers for sale. They're $2 each, and all proceeds go to the Cold Case Foundation, so it is for a good cause. And again, thank you guys just so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.